My mother abandoned me at 13 for a richer man. Now she returned 15 years later, demanding part of my $150K inheritance. But I sued her and kicked her out. The whole town was shocked. I'm 28 years old. I manage two art supply stores that I inherited from my dad. And the truth is, I need to tell this story because what happened a few months ago still has me tossing and turning every night. My mom, Victoria, basically appeared out of nowhere after almost 15 years and tried to manipulate me into taking everything my dad and I built together. And when I say manipulate me, I mean she literally tried to turn my entire family against me, paint this picture of me being a horrible, heartless daughter. The thing is, this story actually starts way before that. When I was 13 years old and my world fell apart in the most brutal way you can imagine. We lived in a small town where everyone knows everyone. You know, one of those places where if you sneeze in the morning, by afternoon everyone already knows you're sick. My dad, Kenneth, had an art supply store that he'd opened like 10 years before I was born. And it wasn't anything fancy. I mean, we weren't rich or anything, but we didn't lack anything either. My mom worked as a personal trainer at a gym in town, and I remember she was always obsessed with her appearance, with staying in shape, with wearing brand name clothes even if they were knockoffs because we couldn't afford the real ones. I guess I should have seen it coming. But when you're 13, you don't pay attention to these things, you know? You don't notice when your mom starts coming home later, when she starts wearing more makeup, when suddenly she has a new phone that nobody gave her. It was a Tuesday. I remember it perfectly because it was the day my dad closed the store early so we could have dinner together. The three of us. I got home from school around 3 in the afternoon and found my mom packing suitcases in her room. Not one suitcase. There were about 4 huge suitcases open on the bed, and she was putting in all her clothes, her shoes, everything. She saw me standing in the doorway and didn't even stop. Just kept folding things and putting them in the suitcases while telling me, with a coldness that still gives me chills, that she had met someone else. A guy named Ryan who apparently had way more money than my dad, who could give her the life she deserved, that she was tired of living in a boring town selling paintbrushes and canvases. Literally. That's how cruel she was. Like my dad and I were obstacles in her path to a better life. I tried to reason with her. I begged her to stay. I told her we could work things out, that my dad loved her, that I needed her. But she just shook her head and said, "This isn't negotiable, Harper. I've already made my decision." When my dad came home like an hour later and saw the suitcases at the entrance, I think his heart literally broke right there. He tried to talk to her, asked her what he could do to make her stay, if she needed time, if it was something he had done. But my mom already had one foot out the door. I remember she told him, "Kenneth, you were a good man, but I need more than this." And then she got into a car where this Ryan guy was waiting for her. She didn't even have the decency to leave alone. And she just left. Just like that. As if the last 15 years hadn't meant anything. The months after that were, I don't even know how to describe them, like a constant hell where my dad tried to keep his composure during the day at the store, but I heard him crying in his room at night. We started having money problems almost immediately because it turned out my mom had taken like half of the savings they had together, and my dad had to take out a loan to keep the store open. I, at 13 years old, basically became his right hand. I'd go to the store after school every day, help with inventory, attend to customers, learn how to use the point-of-sale system. It wasn't a conscious decision like, I'm going to help my dad with the business. It just happened because I couldn't stand to see him sink alone. You know what I mean? During the next few years, like from when I was 13 to 17, my dad and I became an incredible team. The store started doing better. Not much better, but enough to pay the bills and have something extra. My dad never dated anyone again, never showed interest in rebuilding his romantic life, and when I asked him about it, he'd just say, "I already had my chance and I wasted it trusting the wrong person." I think part of him never got over my mom's betrayal, and that broke my heart, but I didn't know how to help him with that. As for my mom, we didn't hear anything from her during all that time. 0 calls, 0 messages, 0 attempts at contact. As if she'd never had a daughter. At first it hurt me so much. I cried every night wondering what I had done wrong, why I wasn't enough for her to stay. But eventually that pain turned into rage, and that rage eventually turned into something more like indifference. I guess, when I was 17, almost 18, something unexpected happened that completely changed our lives. Uncle Howard, My dad's brother, who lived in another state and with whom we didn't have much of a relationship, you think we saw him like once a year at Christmas. Maybe. Died of a heart attack. It was very sudden, like the man was about 55 years old and was completely healthy, or so we thought. The thing is that Uncle Howard never married, never had kids, and it turns out he left us his entire inheritance, which was like $150,000. My dad almost fainted when the lawyer called to tell us. He literally thought it was a scam at first. But no, it was real. The money was ours. My dad did something super smart with that money, something that to this day I'm grateful for. Instead of spending it on nonsense or keeping it in the bank to devalue, he decided to invest it in expanding the business. He opened a second art supply store in a bigger city like 2 hours away, and we completely remodeled the original store, bought better inventory, better brands, professional art equipment that we couldn't have before. The business literally exploded in a good way. We started having customers from everywhere: professional artists, schools, design studios, and most importantly, my dad used part of that money to buy me a small apartment when I turned 18. He told me, "This is yours, Harper. A place where you can start your adult life without worries, without paying rent, without depending on anyone." I decided to study business administration at the local university so I could keep helping at the stores, and my dad gave me an official position as manager of the original store with a decent salary. Everything was going incredibly well, like better than I ever imagined after everything we'd been through. I was in my last semester of college, about to graduate, making plans to expand the business even more, maybe open a third store or start selling online. And then my dad called me one day and said he needed to talk to me about something important. And from the tone of his voice, I knew immediately that something was very wrong. I sat with him in the living room of the house. He still went to visit him like 3 times a week, even though I didn't live there anymore. And he told me he had been having very strong stomach and back pains for months, but hadn't told me anything because he didn't want to worry me during my final exams. He'd finally gone to the doctor and they'd done a bunch of tests, and the results were devastating. He had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Stage 4, basically terminal. The doctors gave him like 6 months to live, maybe less. I was completely paralyzed. I couldn't process what I was hearing. Like my brain literally refused to accept that information. I yelled at him, told him why had he waited so long, that if he'd gone earlier maybe they would have detected it in time, but he just shook his head and said the symptoms had appeared very late, that it probably wouldn't have made a difference. The next few months were a nightmare of chemotherapies, hospitals, watching my dad deteriorate day by day. I stopped going to classes. I literally didn't give a damn about my graduation. I just wanted to be with him as much time as possible. We hired managers for both stores because neither of us was in any condition to work, and basically my life became taking care of my dad 24/7. He lost a ton of weight, all his hair fell out. There were days when he could barely get out of bed. But the worst part wasn't seeing him suffer physically. The worst part was seeing the sadness in his eyes, this resignation that he was going to leave everything incomplete, that he was going to leave me alone, without having had the chance to really see me succeed. My dad died 3 days before my graduation. I was 22 years old at the time. I didn't even go to the graduation ceremony. I stayed home crying while looking at the suit I had bought specifically so he could see me receive my diploma. The funeral was horrible. A lot of people came, because my dad was very beloved in town. But I was like on autopilot, greeting people, thanking condolences, without really processing anything that was happening. The lawyer contacted me like a week later to read me the will, and my dad had left me absolutely everything. Both stores, the house, my apartment, which was technically still in his name, the savings, everything. He had also left very specific instructions about how to manage the business, expansion suggestions, supplier contacts, as if he had been preparing me for this without me realizing it. It took me like a full year to really process my dad's death and start functioning normally again. The managers we had hired kept the stores running, thank God. But I was like lost in a limbo of depression and grief. Eventually, I started going to the stores again, getting involved in operations, and I discovered that I really liked it, that I had inherited my dad's passion for the business. The stores were doing very well, better than ever, in fact, and I started to feel a purpose again, a reason to get up every morning. And then, like a year after my dad's death, when I was 23 and finally starting to rebuild my life, my mom appeared. Just like that, She knocked on the house door on a Saturday morning, and when I opened it, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It had been almost 10 years since the last time I saw her. 10 years without a single call, without a message, without anything, and there she was, standing at my door as if nothing had happened. She looked older, obviously. She was like 45 years old at that time, I think. But she still maintained that obsession with her appearance. Hair perfectly styled, impeccable makeup, brand name gym clothes. And behind her was a teenager, like 14 years old, who looked at me uncomfortably, and I didn't need anyone to tell me that was my half-brother. My mom smiled at me as if we were having a happy reunion after a long vacation and said, "Hi, Harper, you've grown so much," and I literally didn't know whether to close the door in her face or start yelling at her right there. She kept talking without giving me a chance to react. Told me things hadn't worked out with Ryan, surprise, surprise, that she had been living with him all these years and they had a son together. The boy with me is named Spencer, but that Ryan had been unfaithful and was now with another woman and had left them with nothing. She said she had heard about my dad's death. How the hell did she find out? And that she was very sorry she hadn't been there for me, that it had been very hard for her too. The audacity of that woman. Seriously. Talking as if she had suffered some loss when it was she who abandoned us first. Then she got to the real point of her visit. She asked me if they could stay in my apartment temporarily while she looked for work and got something permanent. She said it would only be for a few months, that she didn't want to bother me, but they had nowhere else to go, that her family had rejected her for leaving with Ryan, another Sarais, and that I was her only option. Part of me wanted to tell her to go straight to hell, that I had no obligation to her after what she did to us. But then I looked at the boy, Spencer, who looked super uncomfortable and embarrassed, and I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. The poor kid wasn't to blame for having a manipulative and selfish mother. He hadn't asked to be in this situation, and leaving him on the street seemed cruel to me. So, against all my instincts, against all the alarms that were going off in my head, I told them yes, that they could stay in my apartment temporarily. But, and this was important, I established very clear conditions. I told them they had to pay the utilities, water, electricity, internet, that I wasn't going to subsidize their stay, and that they had a maximum of 6 months to get something permanent. My mom agreed immediately, hugged me and told me I was a wonderful daughter, that she always knew I had a good heart. And I just stood there feeling this horrible mix of guilt and resentment while processing what I had just done. The first 2 months were relatively quiet. I mean, I didn't go to the apartment much because being near my mom gave me anxiety. But Spencer sometimes sent me messages thanking me for letting them stay there. And he seemed like a decent kid trapped in a horrible situation. My mom was supposedly looking for work, going to interviews and all that, but when the first electricity and water bill came, she didn't pay anything. I called her to ask what was going on, and she gave me 1,000 excuses, that the interviews hadn't worked out, that she needed a little more time, that if I could cover it this month and she'd pay me the next one. I told her no, that wasn't the deal. But I ended up paying it myself anyway because otherwise they were going to cut the services and Spencer was going to suffer the consequences. This became a pattern. During the following months, my mom never paid a single bill. She always had some excuse, and I like an idiot kept covering everything because I couldn't leave the kid without water or electricity. But what really started to bother me was that my mom began contacting other family members, distant cousins, uncles I barely knew, telling them this distorted version of the story where I was a cold and calculating daughter who was making her and my half-brother go through hardships. She literally told them I was charging her exorbitant rents, when I wasn't charging her any rent, that I refused to help her financially, when I was paying all her utility, that I had inherited everything from my dad and didn't want to share anything with her, as if she had any right after abandoning us. I started receiving calls and messages from relatives I hadn't seen in years, criticizing me, telling me how could I be so cruel to my own mother, that family is the most important thing, that I should have more compassion. And the most frustrating thing was that when I tried to explain the real situation, nobody believed me. My mom had already planted these seeds that I was the villain and she was the victim, and her ability to manipulate was impressive, honestly. She had learned to cry at the exact moment, to put on that suffering face, to make people feel sorry for her while painting this portrait of me as a heartless daughter. It got to a point, like 6 months after they moved in, where I couldn't take it anymore. My mom not only hadn't gotten a job, I'm not even sure she really looked, hadn't paid a single utility. was using my apartment as if it were hers, and on top of that was destroying my family reputation. I decided I needed legal help to handle this, so I hired a lawyer, Mr. Bennett, who specialized in tenant and property cases. I explained the whole situation to him, and he told me that technically my mom was a tenant without a formal lease agreement, which gave me the right to ask her to leave with appropriate notice. Mr. Bennett prepared a formal eviction notice, giving my mom 30 days to vacate the apartment. When I delivered the document to her, her reaction was dramatic, doesn't even describe what happened. She started crying hysterically, screaming how could I do this to her, that I was her daughter, that I was leaving her on the street with a teenage boy, that my dad would be disappointed in me. That last part hurt me a lot because I knew it wasn't true. My dad would have understood perfectly why I was doing this, but her words made me doubt myself for a moment. Spencer was standing there, clearly mortified by his mom's behavior, and he told me, "I'm sorry, Harper. I know this isn't your fault," which broke my heart because the kid obviously understood the situation better than his own mother. My mom didn't leave after the 30 days, obviously. Instead, she hired her own lawyer. I have no idea where she got the money for that when supposedly she didn't have money to pay basic utilities and decided to fight the eviction. Her legal argument was absolutely ridiculous. She claimed I had promised her she could stay indefinitely, that we had a verbal agreement, that I was evicting her without just cause. All lies, of course, but her lawyer filed the case anyway, and suddenly, I found myself in the middle of a legal battle with my own mother. During this time, my mom's campaign to paint me as the villain intensified exponentially. She used social media to post vague posts about the pain of having a daughter who turns her back on you, shared memes about dysfunctional families and rejected mothers, and people who didn't know the full story gave her all their support in the comments. She even made a post with an old photo of me from when I was like 10 years old, where we were hugging and happy, with text that said something like, "What happened to this sweet girl who used to love me? My heart is broken." And that post went viral in our town, like over 200 shares and hundreds of comments from people who had no idea what had really happened. I had to endure looks of contempt at the supermarket, passive-aggressive comments at my own stores from customers who had seen my mom's posts. Even one of my employees asked me if it was true that I was evicting my mom and my younger brother, and when I explained the complete situation to him, he apologized, but the damage was already done. The anxiety all this caused me was unbearable. I literally started having panic attacks, couldn't sleep well, was constantly worried about what new lie my mom was going to invent, what else she could do to ruin my life. And finally, after 2 months of legal battle, the day of the court hearing arrived. I was extremely nervous, not for fear of losing the case because I knew I had all the evidence on my side receipts showing I paid all the utilities, text messages where my mom promised to pay and never did, the original document where we established the conditions of her stay, but because I knew my mom was going to make a spectacle, and I wasn't wrong. She arrived at court dressed very simply, almost poor, I'd say, nothing like her usual style, clearly trying to look vulnerable and needy. Her eyes were red as if she had been crying all morning. She had tissues in her hand, the whole scene perfectly choreographed to get sympathy. When it was her turn to testify, her performance was Oscar-worthy, literally. She cried while telling her version of events, where she was a desperate mother who had made mistakes in the past. She didn't even really admit what she had done, just said mistakes vaguely, but was trying to come back and be part of her daughter's life again. And her cruel daughter was rejecting her and throwing her out on the street without caring that she had a teenage son to take care of. She said I had changed since I inherited my dad's money, that I had become greedy and materialistic, that my dad's death had turned me into someone cold and incapable of forgiving. Every word that came out of her mouth was a stab, not because it was true, but because she knew exactly how to manipulate the narrative to look good. When it was my turn to testify, I presented all the documents, all the evidence, calmly explained, although inside I was shaking, the whole real story. From the original abandonment when I was 13 to her convenient reappearance after my dad's death, her constant failure to comply with the agreement we had established, her defamation campaign on social media, Mr. Bennett did an excellent job presenting the case, showing that this wasn't a cruel daughter throwing out her mother for no reason, but a property owner exercising her legal right to evict someone who had violated all the terms of her stay and was also causing significant emotional damage. The judge, an older woman about 60 years old who had listened to everything with a neutral expression, finally gave her verdict. She said that, Although she understood this was a difficult and painful family situation, the law was clear. I had every right to evict my mom, especially considering she had failed to meet her obligations, and there was no formal lease agreement to protect her. She gave my mom 2 weeks to completely vacate the apartment and warned that if she didn't do it voluntarily, she would authorize the police to physically remove her. She also mentioned something that surprised me. She told my mom she understood she had lost the opportunity to be a mother when she abandoned her family, and that she couldn't just appear years later and expect everything to magically fix itself, that actions have long-term consequences. My mom left the court sobbing and screaming that this wasn't over, that she would appeal, that I would regret this, but her lawyer told her there were no grounds to appeal, that the case was closed. Spencer found me outside the courthouse, hugged me and told me he was sorry for all this drama, that he understood why I had done what I did, and that he hoped someday we could have a sibling relationship without his mom being involved poisoning everything. That conversation made me cry, because the kid really was a good person trapped in this horrible situation, and I wanted to be able to help him without having to deal with my mom. The 2 weeks passed and my mom finally left the apartment, not without first leaving the place a mess as a last act of revenge. Scratched walls, some broken furniture, but honestly, at that point I didn't care. I just wanted her gone. I don't know exactly where she moved to. Someone told me she went to live with a cousin in another state, but I haven't made efforts to find out either. Spencer sends me messages from time to time, just to keep in touch. And I've offered that if he ever needs anything or wants to visit me, he can do it. But without my mom involved. My mom's social media posts continued for a while, now adding that I had taken her to court and won because I had more money for lawyers, that the system was corrupt and favored the rich, basically any narrative that made her look like a victim. But eventually people in town started to see the truth, especially when some of my employees and customers who knew my real story started defending me publicly, explaining what had really happened. The tide of public opinion slowly started to change, although there are still people who believe my mom's version and probably always will. Now, almost 2 years after all that drama, the stores are doing incredibly well, better than ever, in fact. I opened the third location my dad always wanted, and we're about to launch the online store I'd been planning. I rented the apartment to a young couple of artists who are model tenants and pay everything on time. The house where I grew up is still mine, but I still don't know what to do with it. There are too many memories there, some good and many painful. I've been in therapy for like a year, working on processing all the trauma from the abandonment, my dad's death, my mom's manipulation attempt. And the truth is, it's helped me a lot to understand that none of what happened was my fault, that setting boundaries doesn't make me a bad person, that protecting my mental peace is valid and necessary. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, if I should have been more patient with my mom, if I should have given her more chances. But then I remember everything that happened, all the lies, all the manipulation, and I know I made the right decision. I don't owe anything to someone who abandoned me when I needed her most, and only came back when it was convenient for her, when she thought she could take advantage of me and what my dad built. Spencer turned 17 recently and sent me a message saying that when he turns 18, he wants to come visit me and maybe work a summer at one of the stores. And that makes me happy because it means not everything that came from this the situation was bad, that at least I gained a brother in the process, even if he's one I barely know. Last week, I was organizing some boxes in the attic of the house and found old photos from when my mom still lived with us. Photos of birthdays, Christmases, normal days where we looked like a happy family. And the strange thing is, I didn't feel anything looking at them. No sadness or anger or nostalgia, just like this peaceful indifference. I think I've finally accepted that that woman in the photos doesn't exist anymore. Maybe she never really existed the way I thought. And the person who appeared 2 years ago looking to take advantage of me isn't someone I owe family loyalty or infinite second chances to. I put the photos away again, closed the box, and came down from the attic feeling like I was finally ready to let go of that whole chapter of my life and focus on building the future my dad would have wanted for me.